Welcome to another episode of Global Insights in Professional Security. I'm your host, Michael Gips. Every episode, we look at how security interacts with other disciplines such as law, the media, science and technology, and culture, sometimes taking a broad view and sometimes zooming in on a specific feature. This time, we're looking at the intersection of security and human resources, but in the specific context of pre employment screening. And today I'm honored to welcome our guest, Nick Fishman. Nick, uh, I've written and presented on this issue recently, and Nick is one of the top people I listen to and check in with. Nick, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
And thanks for having me today, Michael. Appreciate it. I have been in the background screening industry for over 20 years now, almost by accident. I started a background screening company back in 1999 at a time when background screening was really just starting to get on the radar of most mainstream employers. We grew that business over the course of about 16 years and eventually sold to one of the largest providers in the background screening industry. We have grown to really love this industry. After selling the company, I stayed on with the organization that bought us. And then after that time, I started consulting with both other background screening providers that were competitors of ours and then also with the companies that provide data to the background screening companies that then sell them to the end users. I've been very blessed. And right now, not only am I doing consulting work in the industry, but I'm also serving as the chief marketing officer of a company called SJB Data Solutions based in Atlanta, Georgia.
That's great. Thanks. And for all our viewers and listeners, I catch Nick on, he does webinars from time to time, and he also writes. And if you Google him, you could find some upcoming presentations he's making and some things he's written. And he writes regularly and keeps folks up to date. So I appreciate that. Uh, let's jump right in. Get to the big question: what pre-employment screening trends are emerging? Are you seeing as we go into 2021 and we get out of the wreckage of 2020? Hopefully, get out of the wreckage of 2020.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll tell you the obvious ones, and this is really a continuation of what's been going on for years, is that companies are looking to find faster, less expensive ways to do background checks. But the good news is, over the last several years, with all of the litigation that's been going on, they're not looking to cut corners like they might have in the past. So that is, I would say, a constant in our industry. I would say that the biggest emerging trend based on the pandemic, though, has been, do protocols need to change? Do processes need to change as a result of having people that are no longer necessarily in the office anymore? What things are important to them? Does it change what their hiring criteria needs to be? That isn't to say that organizations aren't going to do background checks. They absolutely will. It's just a question of what is going to be important to them moving forward and what isn't. So I think that is a key trend to watch this year. Some companies are going to bring employees back into the office, and I imagine then it will be kind of business as usual. But a number that I've been talking to are saying that they will either make work remote optional or they're going remote fully. And at that point, they're going to have to make some decisions about how they screen people and what they decide to use when making their hiring decisions.
So, give me an example of what that would change. Obviously, you're still going to do an employer check. You're going to do a criminal check. If the person drives, for a living, you're going to do a motor vehicle check, an
Mhm.
education check. So, what would change? What else would they do? What might not they do?
Yeah, a couple things. So let's go to the mundane. As far as the traditional background screening criteria, such as criminal and employment and all of those other things, nothing is going to change. What might change is their thresholds or their tolerance for certain things that would come up on a background check. It would be hard for me to highlight examples of some type of criminal activity that might not be as important anymore But I think that they are going to be looking at that and making some determination. So that's the mundane. The other thing that I think is going to become more important as people go remote is information that tells us more about these individuals beyond the pale of normal background screening. So, social media is a trend um, that while we are not seeing a significant uptick in people buying social media background checks, I think it's coming. I know we're going to talk about the Capitol riots in a little bit. That's a perfect example of how employers were using social media to determine whether they had people that were at those rallies and participating in criminal activity. So I do think that reputation type searches are going to become more and more important to employers.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point, and I do want to get to the capital and social media background checks a little later. That's an area I'm fascinated by. I want to start though with we're just getting out of COVID, and during COVID, like at least in the beginning, courts were closed, so you couldn't get criminal records as easily. Um, it wasn't as easy to get in touch with HR departments to do employment checks and everything. Probably the same thing with motor vehicles and maybe and universities. So, um, how has COVID changed things with courts and maybe other or institutions providing information being closed for so long and maybe things gotten backed up?
Sure. Yeah. So as it relates to conducting criminal background checks, there was still a very wide swath of the country that was completely unaffected. And that's because companies like the one I'm working for right now had automated the checks. So they were literally going in without having to send a human being into the court in order to do a check. So let's say that covered 65% of the courts that needed to be searched. So that was obviously very helpful. For those that did need to be searched in person, it really ran the gamut. Some courts just shut their doors and they said, "Nope, we're not letting anybody in. You're just going to have to wait for your information." A good example of that was the state of New Jersey. Basically, shut its doors from April until, let's call it, July. Interestingly, when they came back, so before the pandemic, it was all in person research. Uh, Post pandemic, in July, they released a system that allowed people to go in an automated fashion. Actually, I shouldn't say automated. They allowed people to tap into their court research resources. It needs to be done manually. And they set that up. And then since that time, it created a tremendous backlog in the industry. Obviously, if you needed a background check in New Jersey, you either had to hire somebody and just hope that things were going to work out, or you had to delay their hiring until you could get the completed background check back. So there were instances of that. There were also instances, and I'll give you a good example: Jefferson County in the state of Kentucky. That's where Louisville is based. Went on a major backlog because whereas they used to have a room that was available where court researchers could come in when they wanted to do research, they then went to a reservation system where court researchers had to make an appointment in order to come in. I believe the rule was that they had 20 minutes or 30 minutes at a terminal, and obviously
They're
they
flying.
Ex-
Yeah.
Exactly. And so lines were around the block. It created a major backlog. That backlog is still there. Although I will tell you that from what I understand, Jefferson County is now finally starting to open up a little bit more. Uh, so, I mean, blanket statement on this whole thing, it certainly affected court research for a period of time. Things have been more normal as far as that is concerned for at least the last 3 or 4 months. And every day it's getting better and better.
Oh, that's good. Yes, it's funny you mentioned New Jersey because I know that Rutgers University, which is the state institution of higher learning for New Jersey, put out some sort of statement saying they are only doing very limited background checks and they're going to be doing hiring, but you better watch out when they get back to to regular because they're going to go back and check
Yep.
to
Yep.
so
No, that's a
interesting.
perfect
Yeah,
example of what some employers were doing. Rutgers obviously figured, hey, look, we need to hire people, we need to get them in, but we are going to come back to it, and that's a responsible thing.
yeah, no, that sounded reasonable to me. Another thing that good intentions, and I see why they states all over the country do it, ban the box laws, which, as you know, um, prohibit you from asking someone whether they have a criminal record, if I'm correct, on the employment application. How has that affected background screening?
Okay, so the most benign ban the box laws out there do exactly what you just suggested. They simply say you can't ask that question on the job application, um, but there are no other guidance as to when you can ask that question, what paperwork you have to file. So, in those terms, that kind of benign ban the box, sure, would employers like to know ahead of time? Yes. Could you see how that information could be used unfairly? Yes. I think where ban the box really becomes a problem, Michael, is where it goes far beyond just taking that question off the application. It tells you specifically when you are allowed to ask that question. Most of the time, in some cases, you're never allowed to ask that question. It also comes down to filing different types of paperwork in different jurisdictions. San Francisco is a very good example of that. There is paperwork that needs to be specific paperwork that needs to be filled out every time you make a decision that uh, would adversely affect a job candidate when you find a criminal record. And so I think these laws are well intentioned. And I will say this too. I think just to be fair to all sides, I understand the need for these rules, but I would like to see real research to determine whether these rules actually impact what an employer actually does. Um, in the long run? Does it just delay a decision that they were going to make anyways?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that question. My feeling is it probably does that. The good side of it, though, is okay, you get to know a candidate a little bit better before you find out that information, and then maybe that information isn't as concerning to you as it would be before. Um, there are it's a patchwork of laws all over the states, all over counties, local governments, municipalities, and that becomes a very difficult administrative nightmare and burden for employers and background screening companies. There is, from what I understand, a bill that was introduced into the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, over the last couple of months that would introduce a national ban the box. And I think that's an interesting one. I don't know if it'll pass. You also don't know what kind of bill it is. Is it a bill that just says you can't ask the question? If it is, I actually think employers and background screening companies might applaud that because it's at least it's one set of rules to be able to follow. So we'll see. To be determined.
Right. So it could preempt the state laws that are a
That's
patchwork of
Th-
craziness, right?
that's the hope. That's the hope.
Yeah.
But even with other background screening laws, you see these state and local laws that are sometimes superseding even the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is the main governing law of background checks. So we shall see.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. So another thing I want to bring up, and I have a feeling I know what you're going to say here, but I'm curious anyway. The Body Shop is a retail store that announced in the middle, or actually in the early part of the pandemic, that I guess because of hardship and their need for people, and because courts are closed and it's hard to do background screening, and maybe just for policy reasons, that they were not going to do background checks at all, which seems to me ridiculous and negligent and terrible decision, but I'm not the expert here. I want to hear from the expert. Like, is there, I mean, I can understand it's like, okay, you're getting in people fast, but it just seems to be opening yourself up for tremendous liability. And what do you think?
Yeah, listen, I wasn't all that familiar with with this up until a couple of weeks ago, and then I started doing a little bit of research. So first of all, the articles that I read all stem from about February of 2020.
Hmm.
So really, if you think about it, before the pandemic really took hold, and so when I read what they were doing, I almost wonder if part of that is spillover from 2019 when employment was through the roof and it was harder and harder to find people. If you look further into the article that I was reading, and I think it was in Forbes, actually, we'll give them credit. Um, it was only for distribution and I believe it was warehouse employees. So it didn't apply to the rest of the organization. Now, in my mind, that doesn't excuse it. I think it's okay to have laws or guidelines within an organization that say, "Hey, we are going to expand the hiring pool. We are going to relax our hiring standards. We're going to hire those that might have particular records, but there should be a certain level of scrutiny for those that have records that really could cost people, whether it be their lives, their livelihood, whatever it is." And so, in my mind, I feel like to a certain extent, they this was a hiring pool that they determined that they wanted to go after because they couldn't find other people. It would be very interesting to find out if now they have gone back to a different standard.
Yeah, that I, same question. I wonder how that worked, and if there was the slightest problem, because something happened. It's like, oh, we can't do this anymore. We better, this is it could go really bad. So let's. It would be interesting to know if they reverse that. I may make a couple of phone calls and find out. That's really
Yeah,
fascinating. Um,
yeah.
so let's go. We've teased this from the beginning. Social media's potential in pre-employment screening. I'm fascinated by it, but for all the benefits, there are a lot of challenges as well. Could you lay some of those out?
A lot of challenges in conducting background checks. Are you
Yeah,
talking
like
about?
yeah. So with social media, so
Oh, social media.
social
Okay.
media, yeah,
Yeah, I apologize. So yes, I am I would say I've done a 180 on this. When the concept of a social media background check came out about 10, 15 years ago, I was very adamantly opposed to it. Just because I felt like it was an intrusion on privacy, that there was no regulation around it. But I will say that I have come around significantly on it. And that is for the same reason why a background check is important. If you could have known something, you should have known something, and employers are being held accountable for those kinds of things. So I think that here's the thing: employers have been doing on their own some form of social media background screening as long as social media networks have been around, whether it be LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever. And unfortunately, when they do something like that, they actually leave quite a bit of liability for themselves. There's all kinds of information that they can see, whether it's publicly available or somehow they might have. I've heard of companies phishing to get people to accept friendships, and then they do those searches. That should be off limits. It's really the very public things that somebody would post that gives you insight into things that might cause you concern, whether it be remarks against different races, ethnicities, religious views, what have you. Whether it is video or photographs of something that is clearly out of bounds. I just think it is very important and only going to become more important in the future.
yeah, and I think it gets even more troublesome when you're monitoring folks. And I want to get into continuous monitoring, which is one way of okay, the background check is someone's good at a point in time backwards in time, right? And then you could do another check later, a recheck, and they're good from that point. But it doesn't get necessarily, what's happening continuously. That's what continuous monitoring does. So, and you could explain that a little bit if you want. But in social media, so and we talked about the capital attacks. There were a couple of companies where Goosehead Insurance in Texas, Navistar Direct Marketing in Maryland, where the guy actually wore his badge into the Capitol during the insurrection. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a tremendous reputational hit for that company, an embarrassment. Now, if they had seen this guy saying, "Hey, I'm going to the Capitol tomorrow to break in" or whatever, I mean, probably wasn't that explicit, but
hmm
or he had said something like, "I hate these types of people" or whatever, they could have taken action on him. So that's intriguing, and they could have stopped it. But there are all sorts of other things that can go wrong, right?
sure, yeah. So I will say that I believe that the Capitol riots were really a turning point for a lot of different reasons. So number one, the government, obviously was way out there with the social media checks, trying to find people to prosecute. And as a result, now within government circles, by the way, they are scrambling very quickly to find a solution to allow the government to continuously monitor government employees. And so there's no secret about it, but this is going to become a very big thing in the government. Naturally, you would think if it's a big thing in the government, those in the private sector are going to begin to utilize this as well. And again, with the Capitol riots, not only did you see the government and law enforcement using social media background checks, but you began to see employers, even if they weren't outsourcing it to a third party, they were doing their own. And as a result, people were disciplined and or terminated from their jobs for things that they had seen on social media.
Now, what happens? So I'm doing social media monitoring. I'm being low key about it. It's like, this kind of person's kind of questionable. Let's see what they're doing. Say, okay, Mary Jones, I've been tracking her Facebook, and she happens to be up for a promotion. And oh boy, I noticed that she's buying baby clothes, and people are saying congratulations, on your pregnancy, and she's up for a promotion. Uh-oh. Now, if she doesn't get that job, she can say that it was discrimination on the basis of gender or maybe
Sure.
ADA or whatever. So,
hmm
is it worth it? I mean, maybe you don't want to know what's going on. How do you balance that?
Well, I think this is where the shift comes in. So rather than employers doing it on their own in a very undefined way, I think hiring third parties to do these for you and telling them what is important to you and what is not important to you, and then keeping the what is not important out of any report that you would do. I think that's key. And again, even third parties have much better tools to ensure that whoever they're monitoring or whoever they're conducting that background check on, they're doing the same thing every single time. It's not just, hey, I'm going to troll LinkedIn for a little while and then I'm going to go over here. It's across the board. So I think that there's great value to using a third party. They also have technology that, as opposed to a human being having to type something in, there's automated technology to go into these social networks. And when they see certain, whether it be keywords, images, whatever, they can then flag those and then determine whether those flags should be passed on to their employer clients or not.
Excellent point. Now, one last thing I wanted to ask you is just continuous monitoring in general for background checks. That involves a company, an outside company that gathers information, say continuously on your staff, and if somebody uh, gets a criminal conviction or shows up on a no-fly list or gets disbarred or loses a license or has some sort of public disciplinary proceeding against them or somehow any
hmm
public record, they gather it and you can say, okay, does this matter in the case? Someone got a drunk and disorderly. It doesn't really matter for this position, so we're not going to do anything. But if they're a nurse and they lost their license, obviously you want to do something. So continuous monitoring seems very very logical to me, and but it's still not used that often. I would think there'd have been an explosion in this First of all, am I accurate? Is that right? I mean, is it still in limited use? And if so, why hasn't it taken off?
Yeah, it's a tale of two stories, really, if you think about it. In some areas, it really has taken off. I think, and those are, I think, what I would say is they're very clear cut issues of black and white. So if you think about drivers, a fleet of drivers being out there, they most likely they are being monitored for any motor vehicle infractions on a daily basis, right? Or some kind of regular basis, if not that. If you think about nurses or healthcare practitioners, any kind, they're being monitored every single day, every single month for anything that might turn up on a license. Where I think we've seen a disconnect with that is with arrest monitoring. Somebody gets arrested, and an employer, let's say that they're doing um, not doing continuous background checks, but they're doing interval based background checks. So instead of doing it every day, they're doing it once every 6 months, every year, every 2 years. Could take them a long time to figure out, for instance, for a driving company, that the driver that had a DUI today, it might take them 6 months to then figure out, oh, we got to remove this guy. And that's probably a little bit exaggerated. Um, so the arrest monitoring, I've been a very big advocate of, just because I believe that there's great value, particularly for regulated companies that have significant opportunities for fines and penalties for employing people with certain types of records, that they find out this information immediately. I think where it's become difficult for employers and a little bit murky is that there are no set rules for what you can do once somebody has been arrested, right? It's not just the type of thing where, like through the FCRA, you send them a pre adverse action letter or an adverse action letter and say, okay, you can no longer work here. And so employers need to realize that there are other steps beyond just flat out termination that can be caused when they receive these things. Frankly, some employers don't even want to know. And then in other cases, employers don't know what they're allowed to do or supposed to do when they get that information. So I am hopeful that continuous monitoring for criminal records, specifically arrests, is going to start to evolve. But it between getting the technology, which was there about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and really started picking up. Then you had the pandemic, which sidetracked everybody. I think it's going to take a little while until everybody figures out how to use that information.
Gotcha. This has been great. Before we wrap things up, is there anything else that I didn't ask you, or something that's critical, or just something you think our viewers, listeners should know?
Yeah. So I mean, I think for end users, for companies that are using these background checks, I think it's important that you stay very vigilant with your providers. You want to make sure that you are being as accurate as possible. So while getting checks done quickly is the name of the game, you want to make sure that they're being done accurately and with great quality. The reason for that is there's a ton of litigation out there. There has been for quite some time. It's only going to pick up, and you want to make sure that you're doing things right. So I would say audit your background screening providers. Chances are they're doing a great job for you, but you might as well do it just to make yourself be able to sleep a little bit better at night. I would say, um, trying to think what else I would we've got the legislation, we've got litigation. I think that's really it. And just stick to the course, stick to what you're doing, and stay vigilant. One more thing I would say also, and this has been a common mantra for the last like 10 years, is remember that just one criminal record does not mean somebody isn't able to work for you. You want to make sure you build in guidelines as to what criminal records might give you concern, which don't, and then build it around those job responsibilities. So that's my leave behind.
That's great. So you're not doing it on the fly on a case by case basis. Yeah,
Exactly.
you have a procedure set forth. That's great. This has been fantastically helpful. I know there have been a lot of takeaways for our audience. So thanks again, Nick. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.